In the year 1910, Elder George Albert Smith, a 40-year-old apostle of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, found himself in the humblest of circumstances. Having been frail since birth, the strenuous nature of his supreme discipleship had left the future prophet on the brink of a nervous breakdown.
Therefore, under strict doctor's order, George Albert was sent to the dry and arid climate of St. George, Utah, where he lived all alone in a drafty tent in hopes that the change would renew his strength. In this state of ultimate humility, George Albert Smith turned not to bitterness and frustration, but instead focused his weakened heart and mind on how he could better exemplify the life of Christ in his own behavior. Taking pen and paper in hand, he drew up a creed consisting of 10 charitable directives which he planned to follow every remaining moment of his life, punctuated with this simple yet telling statement:
I would not be an enemy to any living soul.
Though his creed of kindness was drafted during his 4th decade here on earth, his lifelong character proves that these ideals began long before and continued throughout the rest of his life. When George Albert finally departed this life on his 81st birthday, President David O. McKay, one of his counselors, commented,
"He lived as nearly as it is humanly possible for a man to live a Christ-like life."
Throughout his life, George Albert Smith loved his fellow man as himself. Quietly, and most often in secret, he cared for the homeless, the sick, the aged, and the lost soul. As a husband, father, friend, and leader, he inspired his people in both word and deed. Truly, George Albert Smith was a modern prophet of God.
As a descendant of the same bloodline as the prophet Joseph Smith, George Albert came from a noble family heritage. 6 of his ancestors were aboard the world-famous Mayflower, which landed at Plymouth Rock. And several centuries later, 11 others made the harrowing journey across the American plains to the arid Salt Lake Valley. One of these stalwart pioneers was George Albert's grandfather and namesake, George A. Smith, who joined the church in its earliest days and was ordained as the youngest apostle in the history of the church at the age of 21.
The arduous journey of 1849 was a difficult and challenging one for the Smith family, as George A. Smith came with his young family, 3 children. 2 did not survive the trek west. But the child that survived, John Henry Smith, grew to be quite a young man in Salt Lake City, called to be an apostle, and becomes the father of the president of the church we now know as George Albert Smith.
While still a child, young John Henry lost his mother, Sarah Ann Smith, to illness. He was consequently reared by his Aunt Hannah in Utah Valley, some 40 miles south of Salt Lake. At the age of 18, John Henry married Sarah Farr, and the young couple soon began their family. Unfortunately, their first child, John Henry Jr., died in infancy. But eventually, they were blessed with a second baby boy, born on April 4th, 1870. Though weak and fragile, this baby survived and was named George Albert after his paternal grandfather, George A., who was then serving as the first counselor to President Brigham Young.
Little George Albert's maternal grandfather, Loren Farr, was both mayor of Ogden and president of the Weber Stake. Clearly, George Albert Smith had inherited a noble and honorable bloodline. Yet with that lineage came a burden of expectation that would shadow him from his earliest days of youth.
George Albert grew up in a humble home on the corner of West and South Temple Streets in Salt Lake City, directly across the street from Temple Square, and right next door lived his beloved grandpa, George A. Smith.
As the oldest of 11 children born to John Henry and Sarah, George was taught to help around the house almost as soon as he could walk. His chores included feeding the horses and cow, chopping wood, and even helping grease the wheels on the buggies and wagon. As a young toddler, George was also taught by his mother to pray.
I remember Mother took both my little hands in hers and taught me how to pray. Young as I was, that prayer went through me, and I felt confidence in it. I felt secure.
When George Albert Smith was 5 years old, his mother sent him on an errand up to see President Brigham Young and deliver a letter that was requesting some train tickets to go to Ogden so they could see her parents. So this little lad tripped up the street and got to the gate, and there was a burly guard there who just gruffly dismissed him, said, "No, you can't come in." And, George Albert Smith stood his ground and sort of waited. And as he was standing there, President Brigham Young came out and saw him and went over and invited him in, took him right into his office and sat him down on his knee and began to talk to him. He read the letter and got the tickets and gave them to George Albert, and then he gave him some counsel. He said to him, "Now, you have wonderful parents, and they're righteous. I want you to obey your parents. I want you to be an honorable young man."
Young George loved riding the train to visit his grandparents. In fact, he loved it so much that on one occasion, he and a friend walked over half a mile to the Salt Lake train depot and snuck aboard a rail car bound for Ogden. Luckily, however, the conductor spotted the boys before the train departed and quickly sent them home to their worried mothers.
When he was 8 years old, George was baptized by James Moyle. He was then confirmed by his father in a testimony meeting, at which he bore his sweet and humble testimony for the very first time.
Though frail since birth, George, like most boys his age, loved to play outdoors with friends. In the winter, his favorite pastime was sledding.
In the warmer months, he loved to ride horseback into the nearby mountains and camp out under the stars. These boyhood journeys no doubt played a big part in his love for the Boy Scouts of America program, with which he was strongly affiliated during his years as an apostle. George Albert attended 2 grammar schools, the Brigham Young Family School and the 17th Ward School run by his local ward.
For the most part, George was a very good student. He was especially skilled in spelling and grammar, and he was well liked by his fellow students and his teachers because he really had a sense of humor. On one occasion, for example, when the teacher had to leave the room, she told the class that no one was to leave their seats while she was gone. Well, after the teacher left, George picked up his chair, he danced harmlessly around the room, and when the teacher came back, one of the students said that George had left his seat. Well, the teacher asked him if he had left his seat, and George explained, well, he certainly had not. He took his seat with him everywhere he went.
George's witty sense of humor also appeared in his leisure time. Many afternoons, George and his friends would dress up in silly outfits and put on variety shows out behind the family barn. Adults and children from around the neighborhood would pay admission to see the comedy skits and songs performed by the future prophet and his childhood buddies. Of one crazy outfit George Albert later recalled,
My suit was so loud that people could see it a long way off. And long after they couldn't see it anymore, they could still hear it.
However, George Albert's life was not all fun and games. To earn extra money, he and his good friend Tom Peck took on a job delivering newspapers. This job required George to wake up quite early, something which he frequently had a difficult time doing on his own. Therefore, in the absence of an alarm clock, George tied a string around one of his toes and dangled the string out his window each night before going to sleep. In the morning, Tom simply pulled on the string to quietly waken his partner, and the two headed out delivering newspapers.
Up until this time, George had shown little, if any, interest in girls. However, all that changed the day Lucy Emily Woodruff moved into the neighborhood. Lucy was the granddaughter of Wilford Woodruff Sr., the future president of the church. When Lucy's dear mother, Emily Jane, died at the early age of 27, Lucy was sent to reside with her grandparents, who lived just north of John Henry Smith's home.
George Albert took an immediate interest in Lucy, but because he was so young, his actions were not necessarily the brightest. His first attempts to get her attention most often involved childishness and teasing. While playing in the neighborhood, George tied her long braids around a tree trunk. At school, he dipped her hair in an inkwell. And on another occasion, he teased her so much while she was carrying a pail of yeast that she spilled the entire load on the ground. Needless to say, Lucy was not terribly impressed with young George Albert.
Though the family was quite poor, they saved enough money for George Albert to attend Brigham Young Academy for 1 year. Before leaving George to live with relatives in Provo, John Henry gave him an autograph book. Inside the cover, he wrote,
"My dear son, guard thine honor as thy life. Be charitable, virtuous, just, honest and truthful, and life's stream will be a continuous scene of happiness and success. Your loving father, John Henry Smith."
At the Brigham Young Academy, George not only gained a great deal of knowledge in many subjects, but he also matured tremendously. During the Christmas break, as George visited with his family in Salt Lake, he ran into Lucy Woodruff, who was shocked at the amazing change in George Albert's manners. As Lucy was returning home from the store, George offered to carry her packages. Suspiciously, she agreed. At her house, he returned the packages and was on his way. Stunned, Lucy hurried into the house and reported to her grandmother,
"I just met George Smith. He's home from school and he's decent."
Well, grandfather comes from this very poor family, and he had a whole year at BY Academy from the time he was 12 till the time he was 13. And then his father is called on a second mission to Great Britain. And finances are so tight that George Albert had to quit school, and he went to work to help support the family.
Back in Salt Lake City, George set out to find work at the age of 13. Not far from home was ZCMI, a pioneer department store. George inquired with a supervisor in the clothing department, who quickly assured the young man that they could not afford more help at that time. But young George Albert was resolute as he said,
"I did not ask to be paid. I asked for a job. I know that if I'm worth anything, I'll get paid."
With determination like that, George was hired on the spot, punching buttonholes in overalls. And he was paid $2.50 a week.
Over time, notwithstanding his fragile physical nature, George moved into more demanding departments, and his salary most certainly increased. For a while, he worked in the packing department building boxes. Always looking to challenge himself, George built 100 boxes in a single day, while the average for most other employees was 60 boxes per day.
When he was 14 then, and employed by ZCMI, his mother, Sarah Farr Smith, said one day an elderly gentleman knocked on the door and introduced himself as Zebedee Coltrane. And Brother Coltrane said, "Do you have a son?" "Yes. And what is the name of your oldest son?" "George Albert Smith." He said, "How old is he?" "Well, he's 14. He said, "I'm a patriarch, and I have a special blessing to give him." And so he was invited in, and she was asked to be scribe, and Brother Coltrane put his hands on grandfather's head, and he gave him a blessing. He said that grandfather had been called and chosen from before the foundations of the world, and that he would become a mighty apostle, and none of your father's family will excel thee.
The magnitude of the promises made to young George Albert on this occasion are really remarkable and otherwise normal, unassuming boy was now being told that if he remained faithful, he would hold positions in the church greater than anyone in his father's line. Think about what that means. His father, John Henry, was currently serving as a member of the Quorum of the 12. His grandfather, George A. Smith, had been a counselor in the First Presidency. And of course, his grandfather's cousin was Joseph Smith himself. And so George Albert was in essence being told that if he remained faithful, he would one day serve as the president of the church.
Through his teenage years, George maintained his pursuit of the young and sweet Lucy Woodruff. And with his manners now reformed, they became quite good friends, often attending socials and dances together. However, other young men were courting Lucy as well, and several of these other suitors were from families of greater means, with larger, more stylish homes than the Smiths.
Rather than wallow in self-pity because his competing suitor had a nicer yard, George decided he would plant a green lawn to impress Lucy. So I got his younger siblings together, and they raked and got rid of the stones, planted the seed, and much to his dismay, a terrible rainstorm came and washed the seed away. It took him more than a year, but he replanted the lawn, and soon his lawn was just as nice as Lucy's other bowl.
As due reward for his efforts, Lucy and her grandparents soon came to visit the Smith home on a Sunday afternoon following their church meetings. As the young adults sat outside in the shade, Lucy was heard to say,
"George, your family has the most beautiful front yard in the entire ward. I should like to sit under your apple tree whenever you will let me."
Certainly, George was gaining ground with Lucy, but only time would tell when and where her heart would land.
In 1887, John Henry returned from England, and George, at age 17, enrolled again in school. This time, however, he attended the University of Deseret in Salt Lake City, so he could live at home and continue working at a part-time job. After completing another year of schooling, George took the summer of 1888 off to work with a railroad surveying crew. There, he earned good money, but the pay in the end was not worth the sacrifice. The glaring sun and dusty desert wind permanently damaged his eyes, bringing his schooling years to a premature end.
At the age of 18, no longer able to pursue his education, George returned to his former associates at ZCMI, where he was promptly hired as a traveling wholesale grocery salesman, covering the area from Salt Lake City to St. George, Utah.
George enjoyed traveling for the most part. However, it took him away from his cherished Lucy during their still uncertain relationship. Fortunately, Lucy, who now worked in the city recorder's office, had trimmed her broad field of suitors down to just two, George Albert and a young man named Beau Brummel.
Grandma was a very pretty girl, and she was being courted very definitely by another young man who was quite well-to-do and could shower her with gifts. And Grandfather couldn't, and he knew he couldn't, and he felt very timid about it.
While on the road, George made the best of his situation, communicating daily with Lucy through letters. And his mood each day was based largely on whether he received letters in return. Lucy's heart was torn. On one hand, she envisioned a life of almost certain financial stability with many comforts. On the other hand, a life of humble security, laden no doubt with heavy church responsibility. Of this torturous time, she wrote,
"Oh, I'm so sick at heart I can't work. I don't know what to do. My heart is breaking. Perhaps I deserve it."
In 1891, George and his friend William Dougal were called on a mini-mission to southern and central Utah to encourage adolescent church members to participate in the MIA program, a precursor to the Young Men and Women's programs. The call came at an extremely difficult time for George, as things were quite precarious with Lucy. But serving the Lord always came first in George's life, even before his own needs. Therefore, he readily accepted the mission call and departed in the fall of 1891. Just 1 week after leaving Salt Lake City, George received word that Lucy was making plans to marry Mr. Brummel.
Grandfather wrote her a letter in which he said to her, "Dearest Lucy, you are the love of my life. I want no one else and have loved no one else but you. I want you to know that you mean everything to me, but I want only your happiness. I also want you to know I will never be wealthy. I intend to give my life to the service of the Lord and to my family, and that is truly the way I feel. George." Grandma wisely chose George.
On December 31st, 1891, George returned from his MIA mission, only to receive a call to serve a full-time mission to the southern states. Not wanting to carry this troubled relationship into the field with him again, George asked Lucy to marry him, and despite pressure from her other suitor, Lucy agreed.
On May 25, 1892, the young couple were sealed for time and all eternity in the Manti Temple by George's father, John Henry Smith. Unfortunately, however, the joyful bride and groom had less than a month together before George departed for Chattanooga, Tennessee, the headquarters of the Southern States Mission. Of this separation, young Lucy Woodruff Smith wrote,
"I would not detain him, but how can I stand it? He's gone, and I am left alone. My very life seems gone without him."
In the field, George was assigned by his mission president, J. Golden Kimball, to the Middle Tennessee Conference, where he was trained as the mission secretary and second in authority to the mission president. Meanwhile, in Salt Lake, Lucy's rejected suitor began again to make advances on the young bride. While George was unaware of this, John Henry Smith was not. He influenced a speedy mission call that conveniently brought Lucy to the Southern States Mission, where she and George could be together. Lucy was assigned to work in the mission office, while George traveled throughout the mission, meeting with and training the other missionaries.
Though exhausting, George Albert's time in the Tennessee Mission was a great learning experience, both in proselyting and in church administration. His service, however, was not without its challenges. Once, while George and his companion traveled with an investigator family, they were spotted by an anti-Mormon who gathered a mob together to trail the missionaries. However, at the investigator's home, the mob found George Albert and the others singing hymns. Their anger was subdued, and one mobber was even heard to say,
"We have made a mistake. These are not the kind of men we thought they were. Wicked men can't sing like angels, and these men sing like angels."
For 16 months, Elder Smith presided over the work when President Kimball was away on other church business. Though learning from this valuable experience, George Albert was always grateful when President Kimball returned. After 2 years of service, George and Lucy were released from their missions in June of 1894, stopping in Niagara Falls for a much-belated honeymoon before returning to Utah.
Back in Salt Lake City, George Albert and Lucy rented a home on West Temple, where George first recuperated from his strenuous missionary pace before returning to ZCMI as a salesman. As the Smiths settled into their new life, their hopes quickly turned to family. After another year without children, however, they began to worry that they might never have young ones of their own.
Learning of the young couple's concern, George and Lucy were visited by Lucy's grandfather, Wilford Woodruff, now the president of the church. President Woodruff laid his hands upon the head of his granddaughter and blessed her that she would surely bear children.
In less than a year, their faith was rewarded, as Lucy gave birth to a baby girl whom they named Emily, after Lucy's departed mother.
When George Albert Smith returned from his mission, he turned his attention to politics. He and his father were very influential in bringing the Republican Party into the state of Utah, which is a bit curious because the Republicans were the ones who were so staunchly against the LDS faith because of the practice of polygamy. But after the manifesto, then the Republicans got behind the legislation to bring the state of Utah into the United States of America.
At this same time, George Albert threw his energy behind William McKinley's presidential campaign in 1896. Upon his victory, President McKinley appointed George as the receiver of public monies and disbursing agent in the United States Land Office for Utah in 1898. Thus, George Albert Smith became one of the first Latter-day Saints to be appointed to a federal office after Utah received statehood. With this in mind, John Henry and others encouraged George, despite his physical frailties, to run for Congress.
An unsuccessful effort in 1900 was followed by more pressure to run in 1902. But George refused to run against his friend and colleague Reed Smoot, who would end up serving in the United States Senate for many years. Maintaining his steady position at the land office, George and Lucy were soon able to build a home on the lot next to John Henry on West Temple. Here, George and Lucy were blessed with another baby girl, whom they named Edith. During this time, George was called as an assistant in the MIA superintendency, where he worked under the watchful eyes of Wilford Woodruff and Joseph F. Smith.
Because of George Albert's position of receiver of the U.S. Lands Office in Salt Lake City, he got to know people such as President McKinley and President Roosevelt. As a result, he had gone to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901. George Albert Smith had gone out of the music hall to get some fresh air. President McKinley was greeting public on September 6, 1901, when George Albert heard two shots. Someone had shot the President of the United States. During this period between the afternoon assassination and President McKinley's death, that the Vice President met with George Albert Smith. Theodore Roosevelt became a President of the United States upon the death of McKinley, and George Albert Smith was in a perfect position for his future role as President of the Church, in which he would represent the Church to government leaders.
Under the resulting Roosevelt administration, George retained his position in the Land Office and continued his efforts there for several more years. Certainly, George Albert Smith was on the rise in the political and business world. But, as Zebedee Coltrane had prophesied so many years before, the Lord had another mission in mind for this Christ-like young man.
On October 6, 1903, George Albert made his way to the Tabernacle with hopes of attending the Fall General Conference. However, having worked briefly in the land office that morning, he arrived late and was unable to find a seat. Consequently, he crossed the street to his home, where he found a small crowd gathered around the front porch. Sister Nellie Taylor had arrived at the Smith home several minutes earlier to inform Lucy that George Albert had been called as the newest member of the 12 Apostles. Having heard nothing about the call himself, George assured Sister Taylor she was mistaken and made nothing of it. However, Sister Taylor returned a few minutes later with others who confirmed the news.
As you might imagine, George Albert was in shock. His very humble nature, of course, was simply not prepared. He was only 33, he'd never been a bishop or a stake president, and he was extremely sensitive to the possibility of this appearing like nepotism. His father and several other Smiths, including President Joseph F. Smith, were already in high church positions. His modest personality saw the apostles as spiritual giants, and he himself as nothing more than just a faithful follower.
Knowing George Albert's sensitivity to nepotism, John Henry, who felt similarly on the subject, assured his son that he had had nothing to do with the call, and that the call had come directly from the Lord. Therefore, George Albert accepted the call and determined to serve gratefully with his whole soul rather than doubt the will of the Lord. 2 days later, George was ordained as an apostle by President Joseph F. Smith in the upper room of the Salt Lake Temple.
Under the advisement of President Smith, George maintained his position with the Land Office until the end of his appointed term in 1906. Consequently, he was initially given limited assignments in the quorum. Busy as he was, however, Elder Smith never let his sensitivity to others weaken.
There's a story about George Albert Smith that shows how forgiving he was and kind and gentle with other people. That is a real favorite of mine. Apparently one day there was some problem underneath the street in front of the home where President Smith was living. So some men from the city had come and were digging up the street. And to put it lightly, these men were not being very careful with their language. They were using a lot of profanity and swearing quite a bit. And this began to really irritate the neighbors. They had their windows opened, and one of the neighbors, in fact, went out and said, "Could you please be a little bit more careful with your language? You know, President George Albert Smith lives right here. Could you, just out of respect for him, be a little more careful about what you're saying?" And with that, they let loose with a whole new volley of vulgar words and profanity. Well, President Smith himself saw these men out there, and he made some fresh lemonade. And he walked out to where these men were working and said, "You look so hot and tired. Won't you just take a few minutes off and have some ice-cold lemonade?" Well, the men accepted his invitation, came, sat in the shade, had a nice break, returned to their work, and finished their job in silence.
In the fall of 1904, George Albert was able to take a month off from the land office to tour the northern, central, and southern states' missions in the eastern United States. He traveled with Lucy and Edith, and they were also able to visit many of the church historical sites. 1 year later, George and Lucy welcomed their third and last child, a baby boy, into their family, naming him George Albert Smith, Jr. To distinguish him from his father, however, they called him Albert.
In December of 1905, George Albert traveled to Vermont in company with President Smith and other general authorities to dedicate a monument honoring the birthplace of the prophet Joseph Smith. As the junior apostle of the group, George was assigned to make all the travel arrangements. En route, the party also made stops at the Smith Farm and the Hill Cumorah in upstate New York, as well as the Kirtland Temple in Ohio.
Because of the important contacts he made on this trip, George was appointed by the First Presidency to return to New York in the summer of 1907 to acquire the Smith Farm and the Hill Cumorah for the church.
Well, Grandfather made it a project whenever he was in the East to go and visit Pliny Sexton, who just happened to own the Hill Cumorah. And they became good friends. Grandfather was friendly, and he could make friends so easily. And he and Grandmother Lucy went on a special trip to the East Coast to see Pliny Sexton in the hope that he would sell the church the Hill Cumorah. And they didn't just go, they went prepared because Grandmother had $20,000 in bills sewed into her petticoat.
So he arrives back in the Palmyra area, and their attempts to purchase the Hill Cumorah, but was unsuccessful. But the owner of the farm that Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith Sr. had purchased, he was successful. And so out of her clothing, $20,000 cash was ripped out of it, and the church made its first significant purchase in New York.
Once his position at the land office had expired, George was able to intensify his efforts as an apostle, traveling first to the remote areas of Arizona and northern Mexico.
During these early years as an apostle, Elder Smith developed a special knack for seeking out lonely and less fortunate souls. He was especially sensitive to the needs of others during the holidays. And George liked to involve the children in his Christmas visits as well. Little Emily well remembered a visit one Christmas day with an elderly sister.
As we came in, tears ran down her cheeks, and she reached over to take hold of Father's hand. "I'm grateful for your coming," she said, "because if you hadn't come, I would have had no Christmas at all."
In 1908, George traveled throughout the country in company with President Smith. And while the trips were always inspirational, the strenuous schedule was taking its toll on George Albert's mind, body, and spirit.
By 1909, the arduous nature of George's strenuous schedule over the previous several years finally brought the walls crashing in. Elder Smith had been sickly since his earliest days, and he had always dealt with it remarkably well. But now the strain had reached dangerous proportions.
If you know anything about the life of George Albert Smith, he had poor health. You can trace those same problems all the way back to Asel Smith. And I have them. So I'm very aware of what grandfather had to deal with. I think we could lay it down to an adrenal insufficiency. But I have help in this day that he didn't have.
The doctor's recommendation was rest in a peaceful environment. And so upon those recommendations, he was released from his duties in the Quorum of the 12 for a short time, and he spent the spring and the summer of 1909 near a beach in Southern California, where he rested and meditated.
In the fall, George Albert made a brief visit to Salt Lake, but the nervousness soon returned. Again, all his physicians could recommend was rest. This time, George traveled to southern Utah accompanied by Lucy and the children, as well as by his 26-year-old brother, Nathaniel. Following medical advice, Nathaniel erected a tent with a hardwood floor and a wood-burning stove behind the Smiths' rented home. And in this well-ventilated but often lonely environment, George spent over 6 months.
This was for George Albert one of the darkest and most challenging times of his life, but also one of the most remarkable and growing experiences for him. During much of this time, he hardly left bed. There were 6 months when he didn't even change into street clothes because of the way that he was feeling.
One night, while resting in the tent, George Albert had a remarkably vivid dream where he found himself in a beautiful forest near a pristine lake. He began following a clearly marked trail into the woods, and after some distance, he saw a large man approaching him, whom he soon recognized as his grandfather and namesake. George A. Smith stood before him and asked a simple question.
I would like to know what you have done with my name.
At this, George Albert saw his entire life played rapidly before him as if on a picture screen. After this fantastic review of his life, George responded to his grandfather.
I have never done anything with your name of which you need be ashamed.
Hearing this, his grandfather took George Albert into his arms, and instantly, George was awake in his tent, with his head resting on a tear-soaked pillow. With his hope and determination renewed, George Albert wrote his personal creed of kindness, which would guide his thoughts and actions for the rest of his life.
In May of 1910, George and his family left the heat of southern Utah and returned to Salt Lake City, where a room was constructed for him on the North Pier of the Great Salt Lake. Here, Elder Smith spent the summer resting and floating several times a day in the very salty waters of this unique inland sea. That fall and winter, George was moved to a clinic where he was watched over by a skillful staff of doctors and therapists.
The year 1911 found Elder Smith in a remission of his exhaustion, such that he was able to resume some of his duties and also take a very important trip. He traveled in company with his father, John Henry, who was now a member of the First Presidency, to inspect several state capitals in the East and gather information that would aid in the construction of Utah's own Capitol building. The journey itself, however, was not as important as was the time spent with his father, who passed away unexpectedly on October 13, 1911, just months after their trip.
The difficult loss of a cherished father soon returned George Albert to his previous weakened state, and by January of 1912, he was again in a state of total nervous exhaustion. He again traveled to a beach home in Southern California, where he was joined shortly thereafter by Lucy and the children. And outside of a few trips to Utah, he remained there for 16 months. By the summer of 1913, he was back on his feet, able to resume his duties both at home and with the 12.
At the October General Conference of 1913, George Albert was called as an assistant to the First Presidency, with his major responsibility being travel arrangements.
Throughout this time, George Albert received many secular opportunities as well. He was voted first Vice President and then President of the International Irrigation Congress and the International Dry Farm Congress. He was also elected to the board of directors for such businesses as ZCMI, Utah Trust, and the LDS Hospital. And he began his lifelong involvement with the Sons of the American Revolution, the Society for Aid to the Sightless, and the Boy Scouts of America. In November of 1918, President Joseph F. Smith passed away, and the presidency was reorganized under President Heber J. Grant.
In 1919, President Grant called Elder Smith as the new mission president in Europe, prophetically promising that such a mission would prolong his life. Therefore, on June 4th, Elder Smith, along with Lucy, Edith, and Albert, departed for the mission headquarters in Liverpool, England. Emily, who had recently married, remained behind, living in the Smiths' new home on Yale Avenue. With World War I having just come to a close, the European mission was in dire need of rebuilding. George Albert spent more than 6 months negotiating with the British Minister of Labor to obtain 250 new visas for American elders. Throughout that fall and the summer of 1920, George and his 14-year-old son, Albert, toured the British Isles mission, as well as the missions in France, Switzerland, and Scandinavia.
Returning from Brussels, Elder Smith and Albert, and Elder Wells was traveling with them, took an airplane. This was the first experience for any of them to fly in an airplane. Though the ride was a bit bumpy and a bit frightening for them as a first experience, they appreciated the quickness with which they were able to travel and the relative ease. Elder Smith became a tremendous fan of air travel and a great advocate for it. Even though many of the other general authorities counsel that it may be dangerous still, he continued to try whenever he could to take advantage of this new means of transportation. He actually served on the board of one of the first commercial airline companies in the United States.
In November, President Grant wrote to George Albert asking if he wanted to return home before winter, to which the dutiful mission president replied,
"The work here is just getting on its feet, and I think a few months longer will not hurt me. And I prefer to remain until things here are in better condition."
Therefore, the Smith family did not return to Salt Lake City until July of 1921. Shortly after their return, George was called as the General Superintendent of the Young Men's MIA, where he helped strengthen the interaction between Scouting and the Young Men's Organization. He commented,
"There is nothing dearer to my heart than the welfare of the boys in our church, and there is perhaps no other factor being used more effectively for making fine manhood of boys than the Boy Scouts of America."
George Albert held this new position for over 13 years. During this time, he orchestrated the Jubilee celebration of the Young Men's MIA, where nearly 10,000 young men and women marched in a magnificent celebratory parade. Soon after the Jubilee celebration, Elder Smith was called as the committee chairman of the centennial celebration for the church's 100-year anniversary, which was still several years away.
In 1928, Elder Smith was finally able to purchase the historic Hill Cumorah from the estate of Pliny Sexton, who had recently passed away. This acquisition inspired George Albert to organize the Utah Pioneer Trails and Landmarks Association, whose purpose was to help the saints remember the sacrifices of their pioneer ancestors by placing landmarks at significant historical sites. Raising funds from private and corporate donors, this group placed over 120 markers along the Pioneer Trail from Nauvoo to San Diego. The capstone of this project would be in the establishment of the This Is the Place monument in the mouth of Emigration Canyon. Unfortunately, it would take Elder Smith 14 years to bring the now world-famous monument to fruition.
Through the 1930s, Elder Smith battled occasionally with his weak physical nature, but remained diligent in the service of the Lord. Unfortunately, while George Albert's condition improved, Lucy's health deteriorated. Suffering with arthritis and neuralgia, she found little relief from remedies offered by doctors at the time.
By 1937, having battled through several painful years, Lucy was at last nearing the end. On the morning of November 5th, George Albert kissed his loving wife goodbye and left her in the care of a nurse while he went to speak at a friend's funeral. While he was delivering words of inspiration and hope to others, his wife of 45 years slipped quietly through the veil.
Our grandmother died in 1937, and I was 3 years old at the time. And we moved over to live with grandfather in his house and take care of him. And so I was often sent into his room with clean shirts from the laundry, and they were put in a drawer just so. And he was very careful about expenditure of funds, so he had separate collars that you buttoned on to the shirt. And you could wear the shirt for several days, but you had a clean collar every day.
He was only 67 years old when his wife died, and then he resolved never to get married again, which he didn't. So he lived a long, long time as a widower. But a few months after his wife died, the brethren sent George Albert Smith and Rufus K. Hardy on a trip to the islands of the sea, particularly to New Zealand and Australia. Elder Matthew Cowley and his wife had just been called to be the president of the New Zealand mission, and so it was just quite natural that George Albert Smith would take him to the mission. So they traveled first to Hawaii, and then they stopped in American Samoa, and then New Zealand. Brother Smith was there long enough to install Brother Cowley as the new mission president. Then they left and went to Australia and spent 6 weeks visiting everywhere. On that trip, they traveled for 6 months, 27,000 miles. It was a rugged trip. Brother Hardy got sick and had to stay behind, but Elder Smith went back to New Zealand.
The highlight of George Albert's visit to New Zealand was a 4-day celebration called a huitau, thrown by Princess Tepuea Herangi.
The word huitau means annual conference. And all of the members of the church came to a Maori village called Ngarawahia. And they went to the home of the leader, a non-member. Her name was Princess Tepuea. And she gave the church permission to hold huitau in her village. George Albert enjoyed the huitau. He spoke to the saints. They held a testimony meeting, which President Smith attended, 11 hours long. And he received from Princess Tepuea a very, very lovely gift. When he went home, he sent back a year later a beautiful giant Navajo blanket that he had the Navajos make special for her. I was at the huitau in 1939 when President Matthew Cowley and his wife had the privilege of presenting the Navajo blanket to Princess Tepuea.
Returning to Salt Lake City, George Albert, still serving as president of the Society for Aid to the Sightless, brought Helen Keller to Salt Lake City in March of 1941.
By the end of 1941, the United States entered World War II, which seemed only to heighten Elder Smith's pace as he felt greater need to be out among the saints.
What a deplorable condition this old world is in, and how I sympathize with the fine young men who are compelled to leave their loved ones and face the horrors of war.
In June of 1943, Rutger Clausen, the president of the 12, passed away, leaving Elder Smith next in line to lead the quorum.
On July 8th, Elder Smith was set apart as the president of the 12 by President Heber J. Grant. However, in the spring of 1945, President Heber J. Grant passed away.
On Monday, May 21st, 1945, the apostles sustained George Albert Smith as the new president of the church. True to the words of Zebedee Coltrane some 60 years earlier, 75-year-old George Albert Smith had attained the highest possible calling in the church.
In the fall of 1945, President Smith dedicated the beautiful new Idaho Falls Temple. It was also during this time that World War II drew to a close, and President Smith set the highest priority on getting aid to the suffering saints of Europe.
When the war finished, the people of Europe were in a starving, freezing condition. The little church that you belong to went to the President of the United States and said, now, food and clothing and bedding is needed. Our sister who was here, President of the Relief Society, her great organization, had been making quilts. Not ordinary quilts, but handmade quilts that were worthwhile during the years of the war. And they had been storing them. And when I told the President of the United States we'd like to send those things over there, he thought we wanted to sell them. And he said, well, their money isn't any good. Well, I said, we don't want their money. We want to give them. They're our brothers and sisters over there. They're God's children and they're in need. We'd like to send what we have. He said, how long will it take you to prepare it? I said, it's prepared right now. All we need is cars and ships. He smiled and said, you're certainly on the right track. And so we have sent 93 carloads, 40 tons to the car, 80,000 pounds in the car of food and bedding and clothing to those people over there, and paid the expenses getting it over there. And I don't see but what you folks have just as many clothes on as you had before.
In the spring of 1946, President Smith became the first church president to visit the saints in Mexico. While there, he met with a splinter group of more than 1,000 saints that had broken off from the church. George Albert's kind words were so influential that all but a few made the decision to rejoin the church.
Grandfather was truly a disciple of love. I never heard him speak a sharp word, and it was his love and his concern for his fellow man that allowed him to speak without creating any feelings. In fact, he healed feelings over and over again.
Grandfather was not very good looking, and none of us are, but he once said that he lacked the prowess to be an athlete, and that his weak eyes prevented him from being a scholar, but he could excel in human kindness. So he made kindness his specialty.
In 1947, President Smith presided over the centennial celebration which commemorated the arrival of the pioneers in the Salt Lake Valley. And on July 24th, 1947, George Albert was finally able to dedicate the This Is the Place monument that he had dreamed of so many years before.
Despite George Albert's high position in the church, he remained ever humble. During one cold Utah winter, a man came to visit him at the church offices. When President Smith noticed that the man had no coat, he quickly gave him a brand new coat that his daughter had recently given him. When his daughter asked him why he had not given the man his old coat, President Smith simply said the man needed the new coat more than he did.
As president of the ever-growing church, George Albert continued to travel throughout the stakes of North America, attending conferences, dedicating new buildings, and staying close to the saints.
Isn't your name George A. Smith? And I said, yes. Well, he said, I'm sure you're the man. I said, I met George A. Smith here years ago. He was doing missionary work here. Oh, well, I said, that's explained. There was another George A. Smith doing missionary work here, too. Oh, he said it wasn't any other George A. Smith. It was you. Nobody that ever saw that face would forget it.
But in 1949, the nervous exhaustion from years before was returning ever more frequently. He eventually took time off in Southern California as he had done in the past. In 1950, however, President Smith participated in the centennial of the church in the Hawaiian Islands. But the end was certainly nearing for this stalwart prophet of God.
Fortunately for George Albert Smith, the end came quickly. In January of 1951, he stopped going to the office, and soon he was bedridden and really not able to get around at all. On April 4th, 1951, it was his 81st birthday. He died. And it was a sweet and tender moment for his family. Clutched in his hand was the locket from his wife. And I think it was for George Albert Smith a recognition of the strength of the plan of salvation.
The timing of President Smith's death necessitated an adjustment of the April General Conference sessions, as his funeral was held in the Tabernacle on April 7th during the time allotted for the Saturday morning session. Speakers read tributes at his funeral that had been sent by leaders from around the world. Elder Matthew Cowley reiterated George Albert's creed of love.
President George Albert Smith had a creed. To those of us who knew him, it's not necessary to read that creed, because his life was the creed.
Certainly, George Albert Smith lived a life of selflessness, charity, service, and faith, which has, without doubt, made the world a better place.